Now it's time for our regular feature review of the month. With me, as usual, Peregrine Worsthorne and Tony Howard. Tony, you bring up the first topic.
Yes, well, I was rather filled with gloom today because we've had all the alarms and excursions. We had the vote on Wednesday night, and then we had this bonanza, if I can put it that way, of this astonishing Liberal victory last night, astonishing by anyone's dimensions, regardless of their party. And it then suddenly occurred to me this morning that the fun and games might be over, and we now face 5 whole weeks of hard slog. Now, I make that point because we've been used to elections in 1974 that took only 3 weeks. And I remember at the time I was editing the New Statesman, and that meant I could produce 3 issues. My poor successor today is producing 5 separate issues on election topics, and says the Sunday Telegraph that Perry works for. And I think there's a limit to the public's patience. And I know all about the Easter holiday being in the middle and all the rest of it, but I very much wonder whether by May the 3rd, the great British public won't be saying, let's go back to 3-week election campaigns, we like them better.
Any comment on that, Peregrine?
Well, of course, the Conservative Party were pressing very hard to have an early election date, which I think would have been a good idea. But it would have meant people having to interrupt their Easter holidays, so that would have been unpopular. I can't really say I get very worked up one way or the other, whether it's 1 week later or 1 week ahead. If people don't really want to be very actively interested in the election campaign, I'm sure there'll be plenty of other things for them to read.
But it's 5 instead of 3. It's quite a difference,
yes.
You see. There was straight 3 weeks flat, and this is not 4 weeks, it's 5 weeks. And I think that people will find it a pretty dogged-making experience myself.
The thing that got me was that the fact that one person being ill when they took the vote meant that the government was defeated.
I think this does rather. There was years ago a book, wasn't there, written by, I think, Christopher Mayhew, and he called the book Party Games. And I must say that the way we actually organise whether governments survive or fall does seem to me to be a bit primitive. It wasn't only the poor Sir Alfred Broughton who was ill at home, but one Conservative MP whose wife had actually died on the day of the Commons vote on Wednesday, very gallantly and very nobly, was brought into the House of Commons, put in a room by himself, and was what they call nodded through. I think there must be more civilised ways of proceeding than that.
People are always trying to find methods of doing things which don't have drawbacks and don't have flaws. It's part of the belief in utopia that a number of people share, which I don't. I think on the whole that most things are much more clumsy, much more accidental than we like to think, and this includes politics. And I think the fact that the fall of a government depends upon one sick man not turning up for the vote seems to me to fit into how I know life to be. So I don't myself go along with this attempt to try and preclude accidents, preclude illogicalities. The accidents and illogicalities are the very stuff of life, and they should be included in the political process, as indeed they are.
But do you not feel, I feel, a bit of in despair about this coming election, I must say, and I'll tell you why.
A very good reason to be, maybe.
Yeah, well, we won't go into party politics for a moment, although it's partly that I was going to bring up. What I seem to remember in earlier elections, certainly in the 1945 election, that I got terribly involved. I was in the street, I was listening to people talking about in meetings. I felt committed to a party. I felt that the party that was talking to me was committed to its policies. But what I've heard already starting up is not so much what this party wants to do for the country, but what they're saying is that party, you know, if it's the Conservative, it's attacking the Labour, if it's Labour, it's attacking the Conservative, saying that what they hate about them. It's a negative policy so far, I think. They don't say what they're really going to do, they're just saying how much they hate the other party.
I think this is really very unfair to Mrs. Thatcher. Even the Prime Minister yesterday, her opponent in his ministerial broadcast said what the opposition are threatening to do is to pull things up by the roots, a really radical change. Do you want a radical change, was his question to the British people, hoping that the answer would be no. I think you can criticise the Tories for many things, and being a Conservative, I'm not very much in favour of radical change. But you can't possibly, fairly, criticise her for not having made it very clear that if she gets into power, there will be fairly fundamental reversals of policies that have existed since 1945. And basically, you got in 1945 the decision of a new Labour government, backed by a vast majority of the British people, to really push up public expenditure to enormous new heights. inconceivable heights compared to what had gone before the war. This was a fundamental change, and that's again in question. If you vote for Mrs. Thatcher, people vote for Mrs. Thatcher, they know roughly what they're going to get. They may want it, they may not want it, but to accuse her of not putting something straightforward to the British people, I think is very unfair.
Perry, you brought up Mrs. Thatcher. I did not. I was saying that both parties seem to me to be, if you are interested in politics, then you will probably find what each one is saying. What I'm saying is to the voter who is not that interested in politics but wants to vote, they seem to be saying, people generally, that they don't see what positive policies are being put forward. That's what I was saying.
Well,
I wasn't attacking her, I was attacking politicians, really.
I rather deplore this modern habit of people like ourselves saying what we think other people feel.
Well, I'm saying what I feel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think you've no business to feel that way but on this particular election. I mean, I simply think that you are wrong. I think that there are I think there are very interesting things, changes being proposed, and I think that Labour is fighting it on a, which is again rather endearing platform to me. It's a very conservative platform.
If I might get in that word edgeways that I was promised.
My voice seems to
come back miraculously and marvellously. I think that, in fact, a serious point being made by Mavis that things have changed. People do not go out in the streets sort of clapping and cheering when their candidate comes along. There isn't the great enthusiasm of the public meeting. And my own view is that rather as happened to war, if you like, when war appeared on the television screen from Vietnam in America, now politics is something out there that's not quite real. It's something that you see in your living room. And as all the campaign is fought on television, all the individual commitment and enthusiasm has tended to disappear. In 1959, when I was a young reporter on the Manchester Guardian, I went to the most tremendous public meetings up and down the land, huge halls, packed to the doors. That doesn't happen today. And
we know why that doesn't happen.
Well, television, you see, you were making party points. I think there is actually a sociological change that's come about.
I'm genuinely not actually trying to make a party point. I think that we, in London and in our particular profession, the media, we may underestimate the extent to which people are feeling very strongly about this election. I think a lot of people feel that something has gone gravely wrong with the governance of the country, that the unions are not just too powerful, but are using their power in immoral ways. I think there's a good deal of passion underlying what we like to be cynical about, and I suspect that this may come out in this election campaign. I may be wrong, but I think the fact that people don't go to public meetings anymore doesn't really point to a lack of interest, because obviously they're watching on the telly.
Let me pull the final figure at you. The fact is that the highest poll in this country took place in 1951, and since then, with a bump or two, it's been downhill all the way. We've had greater education in the country, many more people going on to universities and polytechnics. Why is it happening?
Well, then let me accept your proposition, which I don't think I actually do, but for the purposes of the argument, let us say that there is a lot of cynicism, there is a lack of any passionate conviction on the part of the majority of people, either for one party or for the other. And I think that the media must, to some extent, regard this as an undesirable development, and insofar as we can, try to persuade people that this is a very dangerous and unfortunate trend. Because it is a dangerous and unfortunate trend if, in fact, people are thinking as you feel. I think we ought to be rather using our time to explain to people why, in fact, there are important things to argue about. There are causes to passionately espouse. And again, this is perhaps you will regard as a party point, I think both her strength and her weakness, Mrs. Thatcher, is that she does feel very strongly. People find this perhaps rather an unwelcome human trait because they feel that it can't be true, she must be simulating it. But the fact is she does feel very strongly. The Prime Minister quite plainly doesn't. The Prime Minister is an archetypal conservative. That's why I feel very drawn to him.
I love the way, Perry, you can put thoughts into our heads by your opinion, and we can never put them in yours. But can we go on to your topic for this month?
Yes, I'm very interested by the argument that's been going on as to how the terrorist suspects in Northern Ireland should be treated by the security forces. And there has been a report, the Bennett report, which called attention to abuses by the security authorities, ill treatment to the suspects in prison and so on. And I think this is a perfectly understandable that there should be this concern, but I think it could be carried too far. I mean, what you've got to get in these matters is the right balance. There's no question about it that the suspected terrorists, when they're held, must be frightened out of their wits that when they're taken behind closed doors into those cells, they may have a pretty rough treatment. And that's something that they've got to feel if they're going to be ever persuaded to tell the truth about their plan. So it's very much in the interest of the public that the terrorists should be scared out of their bloody wits.
Let me just try
but
and
you
follow
don't
this.
want to have the authorities encouraging torture.
Let me just try and follow this. You say they must be scared out of their wits, that they may be going to have a rough time. Now, are you there trying to say that they're not in fact going to have a rough time and it's legitimate to put them in fear, but you're not going to break their eardrums when you get them into the room, or are you defending that as well?
Yeah,
Because there is evidence that there has been torture.
There's evidence, very considerable evidence, that they've been roughed up very badly.
Yes.
Now,
Well,
that's torture. Could be
okay,
called
fine.
torture,
If you want
yeah.
to use it, call it torture.
Well,
Of
let's
course,
call it torture for the sake of
that means it's very
clarity.
difficult to know what you call the really ugly kinds of torture, but still, let's call it torture for the sake of the argument. I think that it is absolutely essential, and I would this would be my principle, that the public authorities make it clear that they don't encourage or condone torture. And of course the difficulties of the French in Algeria is the public authorities did encourage and condone. But having said that, I think one has to go on and say it is very important that the suspects shouldn't place too much confidence in those public declarations, and that the suspects should think, well, maybe this is what the authorities say, but we know that the RUC who risked their life and limb, many of whose relations and friends and colleagues have been killed by us, are going to, when we get us behind the scenes, they're going to rough us up. So you want to have a balance between the policy of the authorities not to encourage, while not so carrying this view that the terrorists can sit back and think our lawyers are going to protect us from all possible eventualities. And I think on the whole we do get that balance right, roughly speaking, right. And I don't myself get very hot under the collar by these reports that occasionally the RUC go too far. Sorry about the voice.
That's all right. But what about the idea of, for instance, putting closed-circuit television while the police are interrogating? Are you against that or for that?
Totally against that.
Why?
Simply because I think, for the reason that I say, I think there's got to be a great element of menace behind interrogation.
Menace?
Menace, of course there has.
But in actual
these
fact,
these
should they
people are
then be-
suspected of having planted a bomb.
Yeah.
You want to get out of them very quickly. Where have they planted the bomb? How many innocent people are they hoping to kill? You want them to go into that interrogation cell scared out of their bloody wits.
Yeah.
If they see a television camera like that, knowing that the Home Secretary is watching, they're going to think they're not going to lay a finger on me. I don't want them to think that. I want them to think if I don't give them this bloody information, they're going to lay 10 fingers on me very quickly. So you see, you don't want to have a camera staring at them and reassuring them, or a solicitor outside telling them, you're right, boyo, they're not going to lay a finger on you. You don't want too many fingers laid on, but you don't want the terrorists to know it.
You want some fingers. I mean, this is all I'm trying to establish from you, Perry. You are absolutely clear in your mind that you're against people being beaten up and being tortured, as Mavis says.
I'm against the public authorities condoning or encouraging
I
such
should hope
behaviour.
so. I should hope so.
Can I bring a more trivial subject up rather quickly, because we're nearly at the end of our time, I think, which is that what would happen if you won nearly £1 million like that lady in Port Talbot, not far from where I come from, won this week on the football pools? Because I've thought about it, and in fact I'm in a kind of terror about it, not that it's ever going to happen to me, but I actually wouldn't want to receive nearly £1 million, I've decided, and I know that sounds very odd, but I actually would be in such agony as to who to give it to and what to
I don't
do
think
with
it sounds
it.
odd at all. I think it's the sum is just too large. If you'd said to me,
Yes.
would I like to win £50,000,
That's right.
I could just about cope with that. But I think, like you, I would say this would change my life too much, and it's really, I can't come to terms with it. Good luck to her. I hope she does very well, and her boyfriend, but it's not something that actually makes me green with envy.
And then what's she going to do with it, you see? Because if she can't spend, if she spends it, that's a rather disastrous thing. And if she's going to invest it, what will she do then?
It would worry me terribly. I've spent all my life worrying about being too poor, but I'm quite sure that one worries as much about being too rich.
Too rich.
But I do think once one's got over those initial doubts, I can think offhand of several things that I would do, and it doesn't take an enormous amount of effort to spend £1 million or £750,000 nowadays. I'd like to buy a house in the south of France, not too near the sea in the hills, and I have servants there running it. I'd like to have a country house somewhere in Gloucestershire with horses to ride. And I think probably once one's got through the obvious things, one will have got through the £1 million. Alternatively, I'd love to give this money to my children.
Yes, right. And I hope my friends wouldn't change towards me if I did get it all. Thank you both very much, and see you next month. And over to